Hi everyone, my name is Kathy, and I have the pleasure of guest speaking here today at Paradox. Like Craig just mentioned, this is my first time giving a sermon, so I'm absolutely terrified right now, but I'm even more excited to be here, and I'm ready to dive straight in, but let me first tell you some things about myself. So, my name is Kathy, I'm Gen Z, so there's that. I was born and raised in Seattle, so I love coffee, Frasier, and overcast days with 60-degree weather. I also went to college in New York City, where I'm going back again. And for my undergraduate, I majored in psychoanalysis, filmmaking, and healthcare, and minored in chemistry, so kind of all over the place. My family moved down here to the Inland Empire at the beginning of 2020, where I had the lovely experience of graduating online. I'm still sad to this day. I subsequently spent most of the pandemic going through a series of existential crises and stressing out about who I am and what am I going to do and why am I here and what the purpose of my life is and so on and so forth forever. And it was my sister actually who introduced me to Paradox, and after attending a few services and joining a discussion group, I was hooked. And what excites me the most about Paradox is that sermons at Paradox are about starting conversations, not ending them. And so the conversation that I want to start with you today is about deconstruction and reconstruction. I'm not sure how you guys all feel when you hear me say, I want to start a conversation about deconstruction. Maybe you're already having conversations about deconstruction. Maybe you're already reconstructing, or maybe this is making you cringe right now. So let me first give you some definitions of what these terms are. So deconstruction. To put it simply, deconstruction is the process of breaking something down into its separate parts in order to understand its meaning, especially in a way that's different from how it was previously understood. So an example of what someone's experience of deconstruction might be is this. So let's say hypothetically, actually not hypothetically, in real life, someone's loved one is diagnosed with cancer. And this person who is a Christian prays and prays and prays to God and asks God, please, please, please heal my loved one. But their loved one ends up passing away. That person may then be in the work of deconstruction, and specifically deconstructing what their relationship to prayer is. On the other hand, we have reconstruction. Reconstruction is the opposite of deconstruction. Whereas in deconstruction, we're breaking something down into its separate parts. In reconstruction, we're putting those parts back together. But in that process, something changes. Because after you break something down, it's unlikely that you'll put it back together in exactly the same way. So if we consider the same hypothetical example, this person's reconstruction might look like realizing that prayer is not necessarily about asking for something, and that prayer is a space for meditation and for contemplation on the beauty and the wonder in the world in the face of suffering. And now that person might pray because it's something that revitalizes them. So the examples that I just gave on deconstruction and reconstruction that's just one example. You can really, in actuality, deconstruct and reconstruct anything. You can deconstruct food, you can deconstruct gender and sexuality, you can deconstruct stereotypes, systems of government, this amazing movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. The possibilities are endless. But I think that a good place to kickstart deconstruction and reconstruction is this. And I'm going to give you a question to think about for the rest of the sermon. So if you get bored, just think back to this question, which is this. What do you think non-Christians think of when they think of Christianity? Or to put it differently, if you were to go up to someone who's not Christian and ask them to play a word association game and say, name the first things that come to your mind when I say Christianity, go. What would that person say? We'll come back to this question later on, but I want you to start thinking about it now. So today, we're going to talk about deconstructing and reconstructing Christian theology and religion, and it's super simple and easy, y'all. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. It's terribly, terribly complicated. And in fact, it's so complicated that before I go into any of it, I want to make 4 disclaimers. Okay, before that, I have an unofficial disclaimer, which is that I have a liberal arts degree. So today we're all gonna dip our toes into some academia. I might name drop Nietzsche, but I promise it'll all relate back to deconstruction and reconstruction. Okay, so here are my 4 disclaimers. So the first disclaimer. First, I want to acknowledge that deconstruction is a hot topic in Christian spaces right now, which means that it's often misrepresented. So whenever I hear or see discourse on deconstruction, and by discourse, I mean YouTube videos and online articles, I see the word deconstruction get thrown around as this fear-mongering buzzword. Some critiques, and I say critiques in quotations, I hear about deconstruction is that it's a selfishly motivated trend that all the young people are doing these days for the sake of clout, sin, and heathenism. And I have a really good example of what I mean about this misinformed critique / misrepresentation of deconstruction. And of course, my example is a TikTok, because I am but a product of my generation, and that's the only way we know how to process things. So for context, at the beginning of the video you're about to see, you'll see a pastor giving a sermon, and basically he's arguing that deconstruction is this passing fad, and it's a phase that all the cool kids are doing these days, and anyone who's deconstructing or is interested in deconstruction is only doing so because it's seen as this like cool and sexy thing to do. And then the rest of the video kind of just demonstrates how silly that analysis is. So here we go.
Deconstruction has become some sort of sexy thing to do.
Is deconstruction sexy?
Deconstruction. Existential crisis. Was everything I believed a lie? The Bible's been weaponized. The rapture is not even in the Bible. Noah's Ark. How though? King James was gay. My Christian family's disowned me. My aunt just called me the Antichrist. Antichrist. All I did was ask questions. Deconstruction. But you know what? It was all worth it because deconstruction is so sexy. The slope is slippery.
Yeah, that's a hard no.
So the reason that I bring this up is because deconstruction and reconstruction are really, really hard and complicated. It's not a trend, it's not a fad, it's not a phase, and the purpose of deconstruction has nothing to do with sex appeal. So this brings me to my second disclaimer, which is that deconstruction is often linked with being ex-evangelical, which I'll explain. But that doesn't make deconstruction a precursor for leaving religious spaces, practices, and/or identities. So what you see here is a graph of search trends for the term ex-evangelical. And ex-evangelical is a term that was coined by writer and podcaster Blake Chastain in 2016 in order to describe folks who have left their religious tradition, namely white evangelical ones in the US, because of various reasons. And by creating this ex-evangelical hashtag, Chastain fostered an identity and a community where people not only experienced understanding and belonging and solidarity, but they also found a safe space to process. But deconstruction is neither limited to nor defined by people who choose to leave religious spaces and identities. And I don't know how else to describe this, but like this. You know how all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares? I think that all ex-evangelicals have probably gone through some sort of deconstruction, but not everyone who deconstructs is automatically an ex-evangelical, a non-Christian, or just like a religious poser who wants an excuse to sin without guilt. In fact, I want to quell the myth that deconstruction is somehow innately unchristian. I put forth the opposite, in fact, that deconstruction should be a cornerstone in the practices and experiences of not just being a healthy Christian, but becoming a more conscientious, loving, and caring Christian, which brings me to my third disclaimer, which is that deconstruction is not bad. In fact, it's healthy because it forces you to practice self-inquiry and exercise your critical thinking muscles, which is essential for spiritual growth and transformation. I really, really like this quote here. If you don't seriously doubt the existence of God every few weeks, you are theologically comatose. Thank you. To me, deconstruction is motivated by and out of a love for God, a respect for Scripture, and a desire to better understand yourself and your beliefs. It is not motivated by a desire to look cool or be trendy or wanting to sin. If I were to amend this quote, I would say that if you don't seriously engage in the work of deconstruction, then you are theologically comatose. Which finally brings me to my fourth disclaimer. This one's a bit of a doozy, so hang in with me, which is that deconstruction is intrinsically related to and entangled with reconstruction. What that means is that practices of deconstruction are always meant to be followed by / done at the same time as practices of reconstruction. Now, even though I just told you that deconstruction and reconstruction are opposites, I'm going to now tell you how they're also the same thing. So at this point, I'm going to talk about a theory from this person. Now, don't be discouraged. I know how black and white photos of dudes who look like this kind of make you question, like, okay, where are you going with this? But I promise it'll be interesting. At least interesting to me. So this is Friedrich Nietzsche. He's a German philosopher who lived from 1844 to 1900. And Nietzsche's kind of like the face of nihilism, and he's most famous for saying God is dead. But however, if my class on Nietzsche taught me anything, it's that Nietzsche's theories are actually hope-generating. And for me personally, they bring me to a closer understanding of the divine. So the Nietzschean idea that we're going to talk about today is a Mobius strip. It has to do with the Mobius strip. Now, before I dive into this theory, which is both mathematical and a Nietzschean theory, I want to remind you that everything I'm about to say has to do with illustrating the relationship between deconstruction and reconstruction. Okay? Got it? All right. So we're going to watch this video about how a Mobius strip is made. So in order to make a Mobius strip, you take a long strip of paper and you fold one end of it 180 degrees, and then you join the two ends. And then when you secure the two ends, you'll have this like enclosed loop of paper. But crucially, if you take a pen, and it's kind of hard to see in this video, but I will also demonstrate it. If you take a pen and you draw on the Mobius strip, by the time your pen reaches the point where you started, you will have written on both sides of the piece of paper without lifting up your pen, and you'll be able to create a full and a continuous loop. So basically, if you draw on a Mobius strip, you'll be able to create a full and continuous loop on both sides of the paper. So what does this mean? Okay, let me tell you. So even though a Mobius strip has two sides, so we have one side here, which is reconstruction, and then one side here is deconstruction. If you fold the side and then join them together, you will have two separate sides that are also one same side, which means that what we call opposites, what we see as being on two sides of a piece of paper like this, when we join them together, they exist in the same space side by side. So I know this is kind of hard to understand, so this will be available after the sermon to like kind of draw on, because I think if you draw on a Mobius strip yourself, you'll see how it's like a never-ending loop, basically. So I encourage you to find me after the sermon and try drawing on this. So in essence, although deconstruction and reconstruction sound like opposites, they're actually inherently related, and they can't be untangled or neatly separated from one another without losing the truth of what they're really about. I really like this description of, these are my slides on how deconstruction and reconstruction are the same thing, and how deconstruction leads into reconstruction, and how reconstruction will often lead you back into deconstruction. Now, I really like this description of deconstruction, which is by YouTuber God is Gray. And she says that deconstruction springs from cognitive dissonance that is desperate to be addressed, paired with real, deep, intuitive spiritual conviction. So I think that everyone should try deconstructing and reconstructing their own theology in order to better understand yourself and your beliefs, to better understand your relationship with other people, those around you, and to ultimately grow as a Christian. So now that we've gotten to understand deconstruction better and see what it is and isn't, and establish that everyone should try it, let's talk about what exactly we are deconstructing. So a good place to start is to just ask ourselves, what is theology? And in answering what theology is, it's important to differentiate theology from religion. So theology is the study of the divine and of sacred texts, whereas religion is the systemic, organized structure of how we practice our theologies. So today we don't have enough time to deconstruct both theology and religion, so we're just going to start with theology, because I've been thinking a lot about theology lately. Honestly, everything makes me think about theology. Like the other day, for instance, I was shopping for dry shampoo, and I came across this brand called Not Your Mother's, which I love, and I highly recommend this brand over the Batiste brand. Ask me why after the sermon. But anyways, I saw this brand, and it got me thinking about my theology. Specifically, that my theology is not my mother's theology. And it was weird when I had that realization, because it wasn't always like that. I remember a time when my theology was very much the theology of my parents, and I almost didn't realize that it had changed and transformed into something that it wasn't. So it got me thinking about when and how my theology started to change. And more importantly, it got me thinking, if my theology is not my mother's theology, then what exactly is my theology? So in order to answer this question, I kind of had to go back to the very basics and ask, how is theology created and shaped, and what factors influence it? So a good definition to go off of in terms of answering this question is this definition of theology by James Cone, which is that theology is the continued attempt of the community to define in every generation its reason for being in the world. A community that does not analyze its existence theologically is a community that does not care what it says or does, and it is a community with no identity. So if theology is our continued attempt at essentially figuring out the meaning of our existence, then how do you do that? How do you build your own theology? Well, this got me thinking about something that actually Pastor Craig said in his sermon series on Job, which is this: the 3 aspects of spiritual growth and transformation, which are experience, scripture, and tradition. Now, originally, these 3 aspects were thought of as being equal, and they were often represented like this, as a stool, with each leg being one aspect. But then a theologian by the name of Reverend Carolyn Metzler proposed an alternative tricycle analogy that emphasizes the importance and the purpose of experience as one of the pillars of spiritual growth. As Craig put it, the stool doesn't work because it emphasizes that all 3 paths are equal. However, this isn't representative, as experience guides and moves tradition and scripture, and tradition and scripture balance experience. So what this means for me is that you shouldn't just blindly follow tradition and scripture, and instead you should trust your own experiences. And I really, really like this analogy because I grew up in the church, but I was never told that my experiences were actually more valuable than the slightly defunct traditions I was told to practice and the literalist interpretations of scripture that I was expected to absorb and accept. Reframing theology through my experience forces me to become more introspective and consider not only what my beliefs are, but also why I believe those beliefs, what believing them does for me and the people around me, and what kind of impact I'm imparting onto the world by way of having those beliefs. And that process that I just described, the process of asking yourself, what are my beliefs? Why do I believe my beliefs? What does believing them do to me? And what kind of worldly impact do my beliefs have? That process is the process of deconstruction and reconstruction. And it's a process that leads to growth and transcendence. Whereas the rejection of deconstruction and the experience of just accepting tradition and scripture without question often leads to stagnation and regression. In fact, have you ever looked at Christianity in our country today and asked yourself, like, how did we get here? Sometimes theologically, I feel like this girl. There we go. So this brings me back to the question that I posed at the beginning, which is the question that kickstarts deconstructive and reconstructive thinking, which is, what do you think non-Christians think of when they think about Christianity? Do you think their answer would be the same as yours or that of another Christian's? Let me rephrase that question to match this analogy. Where do you see Christianity going? Where do you think non-Christians see Christianity heading? And in what direction do you yourself want to go? Because those are probably, most likely won't all be in the same direction. So in other words, in what direction do you want your theology to go? In what direction do you see Christianity in general heading? And in what direction would you think non-Christians see Christianity heading? Now, the exciting part about this is that ultimately you get to decide what direction to take your theology. As cliche as it sounds, everyone's in charge of their own theological destiny, but it's often hard to know exactly where to go. So these are a handful of resources that I personally found extremely helpful in my experience of deconstruction and reconstruction. And this is just a taste of what I like to call Kathy's Guide to Reconstruction. And if you're interested to learn more, we'll be posting a PDF of the full guide on Paradox's website in the next coming days. So I pretty much spent the entire pandemic in deconstruction. For me, I kind of found myself in what felt like a positive feedback loop of deconstruction and existential crises. And sometimes it didn't feel so great, especially when deconstruction put me in a place where I felt like I had nowhere to go. So to people who are deconstructing or who have identified with what I said on deconstruction, I want to say this. I feel you. I really, really do. I feel how confusing and sometimes painful, yet also still hope-generating deconstruction can be. So I want to give space for that emotional labor that deconstruction can require. And that being said, I also want to remind you that you are not alone. I want to remind you that deconstruction is healthy and good, and that most importantly, deconstruction doesn't disqualify you from being a Christian. I'm like as deep in deconstruction as a person can get, and despite that fact, / because of it, I am here today preaching in front of you and going to seminary. So it does not mean that you are unchristian or that you hate God just because you want to ask questions and have doubts. And then finally, to people who are reconstructing, I want to say, please share with us what is working for you. I'm sure that not only me, but also everyone else who is deconstructing would be very interested in whatever next steps that you find helpful. And I want to end by saying that to me, Paradox is a community of deconstruction and reconstruction. And so I wanted to end by asking you this question, which is, are you deconstructing or reconstructing? And what have you discovered and or learned through that process? So I think you can text in your answers, and then they'll come up on stage, but thank you so much.